What's up, outliers? Welcome to Performance Bites for bite-sized insights into complex subjects in health and performance. Today, we're going to talk about hypertrophy. So hypertrophy is the part of training where a lot of people kind of get confused with strength. So hypertrophy is what's typically going to help people gain more size to their muscle tissue. The act of it is to literally break down the muscle tissue so that it can come back and rebuild itself bigger, stronger. And so kind of gets a little bit confused with the strength. So we did a performance bite on the strength, and we talked about what is strength with the intensities, what's really happening during strength training compared to what's happening during hypertrophy. So we did talk a little bit about hypertrophy in that episode, but we're going to focus strictly on hypertrophy, and we'll probably remind you the differences as well. So hypertrophy essentially is training with a higher rep count, lower intensity than strength so that you can break down more tissue so that it can come back and grow bigger. So how does this happen? So when we're training, our muscle fibers have two filaments, and one's called actin and one is called myosin. So the actin and myosin sit inside muscle fibers. Essentially, these two contractile proteins are the two things that grab onto each other to actually shorten muscle fibers and create contraction, which would be our concentric contraction, so the shortening contraction state. Now, the myosin have these little heads, which if you're listening and not watching, I am essentially showing this little head with my fist coming off my wrist. And so myosin have these little heads that essentially move and grab onto the actin, which the actin is more flat, and they grab onto each other. And then once it grabs on, the myosin heads will shift and cause a shortening. And within all of this is like the sarcomeres and the Z lines and like all these different things that are going on, very small level. However, what essentially is happening is when those myosin and actin grab onto each other, a shortening effect is happening. And that is stimulated through hormones, that's stimulated through minerals, actually, and electricity, electrolytes, stuff like that go in and actually stimulate these things to grab onto each other and also help to release them. Calcium is a really important one of those minerals that actually facilitates a lot of that, and so is potassium. So what's happening is when we're doing hypertrophy training, we're essentially causing these two muscle filaments, contractile proteins, to break down more compared to when we're doing like strength training. We're activating the nervous system to essentially ask for more muscle to come and squeeze to give us a greater result of strength. But hypertrophy, since we're going at a lower intensity and for higher repetition, we kind of bypass that a little bit, and we're causing more of this breakdown to occur within those myosin and actin so that they can grow back bigger and stronger. And this is where some people hear about like doing like eccentric training. So when I talked about the myosin and actin and concentric shortening contraction, essentially eccentric is the opposite. So it's an elongation contraction. So if you were to flex your bicep and curl your wrist up to your shoulder, that's your concentric contraction of your bicep. Meanwhile, if you keep that contraction, which you can, and then you lower your hand away from your shoulder, that's your eccentric. That eccentric contraction actually causes those myosin heads to rip off and cause that breakdown to occur even more so. So eccentric training can be a great way to facilitate more hypertrophy and taking tempo work, say it's like a 3-second eccentric on a squat or something like that to actually help to break down more muscle tissue. You can do that in lower repetition compared to if you don't do any eccentric like elongation, you're going to just do higher repetition to cause that breakdown. So when we're doing hypertrophy, we're looking at roughly 65 to 85% of our 1 rep max. Now, If you don't know what your 1 rep max is, you can go off of reps in reserve. That's typically going to put you at like 2 reps in reserve. So usually reps are going to be anywhere from 8 up to maybe even 20. I like to personally keep my athletes, if we're doing hypertrophy, more from like 8 to 15, just because when you get above 15, sometimes you start to lose the integrity of the movement and the form starts to break down a little bit too much, which you expect form to deteriorate throughout a set. That's just normal. However, what kind of has happened and what I've seen throughout my career is whenever we get past 15, the form really kind of starts to get a little bit too shitty. And so it's not really worth practicing bad movement just for an outcome. So if I have an athlete that is, going to 20 reps, let's just say on a dumbbell bench press, I would rather them go to 15 reps and increase their weight intensity upwards. Because if you're going 20 reps, you're really staying kind of like in your 60% 1 rep max, like fairly low of your 1 rep max to be able to do that many repetition. Yes, you can grind it out and you can push harder and stuff like that. However, I would rather see an athlete go 70 to 75% of their 1 rep max and get up to 14, 15 reps with a lot of good control and a lot of good integrity to the movement, essentially. Now, typically, if you're doing higher repetition with lower intensity, your rest periods are going to be shorter than they would be in strength. So jumping back to what strength looked like, 3 up to 6 repetition, 85 up to 95% of 1 rep max, essentially. There's some variance in that. But your rest periods are going to extend fairly far because of that, in the like 3 to 5 minute ranges, because the taxation on the nervous system is quite significant because of the heavy load. Now, if you're doing, let's just stick with that 15 rep example, you're likely using a lower intensity, call it that 70 or 75% of 1 rep max. And so the nervous system isn't getting as roached, essentially, in that set as it would if it was 95%. So the rest periods can kind of start to shrink down anywhere from a minute to 90 seconds. But there's a caveat to that. With big compound movements, say a barbell back squat, a barbell deadlift, barbell bench press, whatever, compound movement is essentially using a lot of muscles at once. Big movements, multi-joint movements are going to cause larger taxation because you're just using more. That's just how it works, plain and simple. So if we look at it that way, we look at it as like, okay, maybe a smaller movement, a bicep curl, single joint, single muscular action, you're going to be able to take shorter rest periods compared to if you're doing like a heavy 70% barbell back squat for 12 reps or something like that. You might want to take your time in your rest, and that time period might kick up from, a minute to maybe 2 minutes. Now, another really cool way to manipulate hypertrophy into training is through compound sets. So compound sets are when we're taking 2 exercises that use the same muscle group slightly differently. A great example of this would be a barbell back squat and a lunge. So both very quad glute dominant exercises. Of course, hamstrings are involved in both of those, but very quad and glute dominating. So if I wanted to, say, do a barbell back squat for 10 reps, and then I'm using 70% of my 1 rep max in that, I rack it in, and then I instantly do walking lunges for 20, 10 on each leg. That's a really great way to facilitate hypertrophy as well, because you get a different movement, but you're still activating the same muscle groups. And that can really break down a lot of tissue and create the adaptation that you're essentially shooting for. Now, contrary to the superset, which is essentially if I was doing a barbell back squat where it's that quad and glute dominated exercise, I would do, say, a hamstring curl afterwards. So quad, then hamstring, which are agonist antagonist muscles. Another example of this would be like push-ups and bicep curls. So we're using opposite muscle groups. You can use these methods of a superset to facilitate hypertrophy if you're, say, doing the right intensities and the right reps for both of them, and you're just kind of actually shaving time. So in hypertrophy, supersets can totally be something that is used, but the compound set is going to be something that just like really breaks that tissue down, which is going to cause a lot of things to happen, like especially hormonally. So we're going to get more human growth hormone, which is a big helper in muscle recovery and muscle growth. We're going to get insulin-like growth factor 1, which is another big helper, and then also testosterone. So we get like this like flood of hormones into the muscle to essentially say, hey, there's a big stress, a damage, and we need to make an adaptation. So we're going to send the right hormones into that area to help facilitate those things. Now, inflammation and fluid retention is going to occur during this because it's damaged tissue. No different than, say, if you were to, fall and bump your shoulder into something. There's going to be swelling. There's going to be fluid that's going to go in there. Now, inflammation in this situation is actually a good thing because that is what's going to help heal the area that you have damaged and are trying to create an adaptation to. So I always tell people this, like with cold therapies. If you're working on strength training, doing ice baths, doing cold showers isn't going to really stunt your gains very much. But if you're doing hypertrophy, it actually can, because when you remove that inflammation out of the tissue, you're going to be reducing the speed of healing essentially on that area of the body. So if you have all this fluid, all this inflammation because you broke down myosin and the actin inside of the muscle filaments, and those are now asking for the help of hormones, asking for the help of inflammation to recover them so that you can be better, stronger. And then you go and take an ice bath and you remove that stuff out of there because the constriction occurs and you kind of flush it all out. You're going to stunt your progress of trying to gain more muscle or more muscle size. So just a little bit of a tidbit there. Now, when we look at muscle fibers as well, we're looking at slow twitch and fast twitch muscle fibers. Both are always activated. Some people have more type 2 fast, some people have more type 1 slow. But no matter what, everyone has a mixture of it. And if you're doing movement to failure in hypertrophy, or you're doing heavy movement in strength, you're going to activate all muscles. It's kind of like all hands on deck type thing. And that's the whole point of it, is to get everything involved so that either there's an adaptation that occurs to the nervous system in strength, or there's an adaptation that occurs in the muscle fibers in hypertrophy. Now, throughout these adaptations, you're also going to be getting greater mitochondrial density. So mitochondria producing the ATP of the energy source and energy currency in the body. Get more mitochondria, that's wonderful. And then we're also going to get better capillary density, which you also can achieve through endurance style training. But more capillary density is wonderful because you have your arteries that carry blood away from your heart, and then you have your veins that carry blood back to your lungs and heart. Now, the capillaries are the little guys that transfer everything at the cellular level. So if you can have more of those, you can get more oxygen in and you can get more byproduct out. And so that's a great thing for all athletes, but also just people in general. Like, the more efficient your body is and the more that it's a well-oiled machine, the better, right? So if we can increase that mitochondrial density, we can increase the capillary density, we can break down muscle tissue, build it back better. These are all great things that are going to help athletes. All of the great things are going to help high performers and also just your weekend warriors. So really strong adaptations are occurring within this. Now, if we go and look at this from a different lens and we look at, okay, I'm trying to gain size, right? Because that's what hypertrophy is essentially is we're trying to gain muscular size. And the analogy that I always use is, if you have a pile of dirt And all you're ever doing is shuffling around with your shovel. You're never adding anything to it. You're shuffling around. You can remodel that dirt as many ways as you want possible, but it's never going to grow in its total volume until you add more dirt. So in this instance, we're looking at things of nutrition for hypertrophy, because the whole point of hypertrophy is to gain more muscle size. You're not going to gain more muscle size if there's not an excess of calories to go build that muscle. We're not made of magic. We're made of proteins, and those proteins come through consumption. So when we're trying to do things like hypertrophy and training, we need to make sure that we're getting adequate protein to ensure that we're actually providing the body with what it needs to get bigger. Now, this doesn't mean you can't perform hypertrophy style training while in a baseline, calorie in, calorie out type situation. It just means that if you actually want to see gain in size, you need to have excess there. And I highly, encourage people and athletes whenever I'm working with them to make sure that those extra calories are coming through protein, because you're breaking tissue down, and tissue is protein. So if you want it to come back better, you need to provide it with what it's made of, which is more amino acids, essentially. Now, yes, that does come with making sure you're getting adequate carbohydrate for, proper blood sugar, for glycogen restorage and stuff like that, because that is important for performance. But if you want the muscles to actually rebuild better, you need the protein, and then a little bit of the carbohydrate actually helps facilitate that protein a little bit more. And then fats help the hormones. So good fats, of course. We want good fats to help our hormones. Now, if you're an individual and you're thinking, when should I use hypertrophy training? That is going to be something that depends on the goal. So I'm going to speak from a place of an athlete. If an athlete is doing hypertrophy, it's typically going to be in a off season, which is then going to build to like a strength and then to a power phase. So there's phases to the training to help facilitate adaptations over time. Now, if you're just a individual that would like to grow more muscle, you can easily go through a 12 to 16 week training program of pure hypertrophy. And as long as you're getting that adequate protein that I spoke about, you're going to gain size in your muscle, which is great because more muscle, better metabolism, stronger, feel better, move better, so forth, as long as you're doing mobility and stuff like that, of course. So it really kind of depends on the goal at hand. If there's a sport that is involved, that really kind of dictates when hypertrophy should be being done. Because if you're let's just say you're somebody that's going to go run a 10K, probably shouldn't be training hypertrophy up into your 10K because your muscles are going to be broke down, not feeling very good during your run training, probably not a great time. However, if you have 4 months until your 10K and you want to do, say, 6 weeks of hypertrophy training before you get into like your heavy runs, great. I think that's a great idea. You're going to get stronger. You're going to build more capillary density. You're going to build more mitochondria. Those are all great things for running as well. So, building up the strength of the muscle also builds up the strength of the tendons, the joints, and everything like that. So that's a good example there. If you're a athlete that has like a full competitive season, then like I said, more than likely it's going to be something done in the off season because of the amount of muscular breakdown and soreness that it can occur. Shout out to DOMS, which is delayed onset muscle soreness, something that does happen within hypertrophy. Usually not the goal per se, but it will occur. And that usually happens 24 to 36 hours after the workout. You start to feel that soreness. So shout out the DOMS. Now, back to the athlete that has a full training season. We don't want them to essentially be building or breaking down their muscular tissue in competition. The exact same thing as like the runner, essentially. So we do a lot of the hypertrophy training out of season to help develop the muscles, make adaptations for more of the strength and the power style training. So all of this really kind of comes back to when and what you're doing and stuff like that. And that's where, having somebody to look to, a coach to ask for, help with that can be a really great thing, because sometimes we get a little bit lost, and we just don't know what is what. And we hear things on the internet or in the zeitgeist of this is what we should be doing. And there's definitely a method to the madness with all these different things within training and within health and wellness, just in general. So it's usually a system. It's something that's set up, for a certain adaptation to occur over a certain amount of time so that you can be ready and feeling proper for, an event or whatever it is that you're shooting for. So yeah, hypertrophy, super cool topic. I personally train hypertrophy at the right times for myself, of course. So I encourage it. I think having phases of training where you're doing like some endurance style training, some hypertrophy training, some strength training, some power training is really, really helpful for the body and your overall like health and athletics. But at the same time, there is such thing as a hybrid training where you kind of mesh all these things together and work them out. And I personally do a lot of hybrid training, and I have wrote programs for hybrid training. So if that's something that you're interested in, go over to outlierathlete.com, check out those programs. But otherwise, if you want to just do hypertrophy, we got that too. If you want to do strength, we got that too. So shameless plug on those. But yeah, super cool topic. So thank you so much for listening or watching this. And, like I always say, like, subscribe, comment, share, rate. All these things are so helpful to help grow the channel, to help grow Outlier, and get this information out to more people. So thank you for listening or watching. I'll catch you in the next one.